After this video, you will have learned the uses of the preterite tense and also the forms of the preterite tense, both regular and irregular conjugations. The following is a list of vocabulary that's important to note when you're studying the preterite tense in Spanish. All of these vocabulary words describe single completed actions in the past, which is when we use the preterite in Spanish. The following are the regular verb endings for the preterite tense in Spanish. What you do is you add these endings onto the stem of a verb. Please note, in the AR verb endings in the yo form and the third person singular form both have accents, and also in ER and IR verb forms, the yo form has an accent, as does the third person singular as well. In terms of the uses of the preterite tense in Spanish, you would use the preterite tense if you would want to describe a single completed action in the past. And the way to remember that is by using the acronym SCAP. Some examples of the preterite tense used in Spanish and what they equate to in English would be as follows. Tu bailaste would translate to either you danced or did you dance in English, or in a question, bailaste tú, did you dance or you danced. Other examples, ¿a dónde fue usted? Where did you go? Usted fue al teatro, you went to the theater, or you did go to the theater. All in the past tense, describing single completed actions. In terms of conjugating using the preterite tense, you do not want to use any conjugation rules that you remembered about the present tense, because it's totally different. The irregulars in the present tense are not necessarily irregulars in the preterite tense. For example, the verb contar, to tell or to count, and the verb perder, to lose, both in the present tense have stem changes. However, in the preterite tense, they do not have stem changes. Please note the preterite tense conjugations here. The O's do not change to UEs, and the E's do not change to IEs in the preterite tense, as they would in the present. Here are some examples of regular verbs when they're conjugated in the preterite tense. What you should do now is pause the video and practice conjugating these verbs with the given subjects in the preterite tense. When you unpause the video, the answers will pop up on the next slide. You should pause the video now and practice conjugating these verbs. Here are the answers to the previous screen's exercise. If you would like to check your answers, you should pause this video and check your answers now. Okay, so we just saw how to conjugate verbs regularly in the preterite tense. Now we're going to look at some irregular conjugations in the preterite tense and verbs that are irregular. Instead of memorizing a whole bunch of forms, when you're learning Spanish conjugations, it's important to look for patterns. One pattern or one group of irregular verbs in the preterite tense have spell changes, tienen cambios ortográficos. And those verbs, the pattern that you look for are verbs that end in CAR, GAR, and ZAR. And the irregularity of this conjugation in the preterite tense only happens in the yo form. That's why it's highlighted here in the conjugation box. Now below I have a couple of notes. These verbs that end in CAR, GAR, and ZAR are irregular in the yo form only. And the spell changes that occur are as follows. The C's will change to QUs if the verb ended in CAR. The G would change to a GU if the verb ended in GAR, and the Z would change to a C if the verb ended in ZAR. Now you might be wondering, why does this happen? So let's take a look at a couple of examples. Let's take a look at the verb criticar, a verb that ends in CAR. If I put it in the yo form in the preterite tense, critice, it loses, or the pronunciation changes when we add an E to the stem. We want it to sound like a hard C, criticar. So to do that, we can change the C. If you look at the bottom of the screen, we can change the C to a QU. So now it sounds like critique and not critice. Likewise, the verb jugar, the infinitive, has a hard G sound, where when we put it in the preterite tense, it's pronounced jugué, where the G has now an H sound, and we want it to have that hard G, just like the infinitive, we want it to match. So if we look at the bottom of the screen, what we did is we changed the G to a GU, and now it sounds like jugué when we pronounce it. Now the verbs that end in ZAR aren't as clear-cut as the car-gar verbs. So the way that I remember that you change the Z to a C is that very rarely or never do we see the letter E follow a Z. We learned that way back at the beginning of our Spanish career when we make the noun lápiz plural. When we make it lápices, the Z changes to a C. So it's the same kind of a rule here. So let's just remember the Z changes to C and verbs that end in ZAR in the preterite tense. Here are some examples of the conjugations, the whole conjugation. So the verb criticar, to criticize. Here's the change in the yo form, critique, and the rest of the verb is regular. The C does not change to QU. Jugar, to play. Jugué, the G changes to GU only in the yo form. The rest of the verb does not have a U in there. And then lanzar, to throw, is an example of a verb that ends in ZAR, and in the yo form the Z changed to C. A different set of irregular verbs in the preterite are IR verbs. Remember how we talked about looking for patterns when we are looking for irregular verbs? Well, this pattern is that all of these verbs will be IR verbs, and these verbs will have a stem change in the third person singular and plural. So it's important to note that this bullet down here, only IR verbs are considered to be stem changing verbs in the preterite tense. These verbs will be irregular in the third person singular and plural. If you note the graph above, I've highlighted that area. And the stem change that will occur will be an E will go to I, or an O will go to a U. A way that I remember these verbs is I call them ankle sock verbs. In the present tense, there are some stem changing verbs that sometimes we would call boot verbs, because when you draw a picture around the irregularity, it looks like a boot. These specific verbs, these stem changing verbs, I like to call ankle sock verbs, because when you draw around the irregularity, it's like an ankle sock, a short sock. So here's an example of an IR verb, the verb morir, that has a stem change. As you can see, it only changes O to U in the third person singular and third person plural. Here's an example of an IR verb, divertirse, where the E will change to the I in the ankle sock, down here. Notice the rest of the verb does not have the change. Here are other examples of stem changing verbs in the preterite tense. If you haven't realized already, all of these stem changing verbs in the preterite tense also have a stem change in the present tense. So that's a way that you can remember that's a strategy you can use to remember all of the stem changing verbs in the preterite tense will also have a stem change in the present tense, but not the same stem change. The stem change that occurs in the preterite tense is seen on the screen right here. Something else that's important to remember and to note is that all of these preterite tense stem changing verbs are IR verbs. They all end in IR. Okay, well, we just looked at stem changing verbs in the preterite tense. A third group of irregular verbs in the preterite are verbs that have spell changes in the preterite tense, and those changes occur in the third person singular and plural as well, as highlighted in this graph. If you read up top, verbs with double vowels before the R ending will have a spell change in the third person singular and third person plural. Now, when we talk about patterns, the pattern that we want to look for here is that verbs that end in AER, EER, or UIR will have a spell change. And the spell change that occurs is that when you conjugate the verb in the preterite tense, an I will go to a Y. Also, accents are to be added over the second vowel, letter I, in all the other forms. Let's look at an example. Here's an example of caer, to fall. Notice it ends in aer. And notice the conjugation. In the third person singular and third person plural, the I changed to a Y. So we have cayó and cayeron. The pronunciation does not change very much. The rest of the verb also carries an accent over that I. An example of a verb that ends in EER with a spelling change in the preterite tense is leer. Notice in the third person singular and plural, the I changed to Y, and then the rest of the verb carries an accent over the I's. Here's a verb that ends in UIR. Notice the spell change in the third person singular and third person plural. The I goes to a Y. And then in the rest of the verb, there are actions over the I. An exception to this rule, verbs ending in UIR, verbs that end in NY UIR do not follow this rule. A final group of irregulars in the preterite tense are verbs that have radical changes. This means that the conjugations do not follow any particular conjugation rule. There are 3 verbs that fall into this category, and they are ser, to be, ir, to go, and dar, to give. Let's look at some conjugations. Both ser and ir have the same conjugations in the preterite tense. What you're going to have to do is use context clues, or clues are found around the word, to determine whether ser is being used or ir is being used when speaking in the past. Below are the conjugations of ser and ir in the preterite tense. Fui, fuiste, fue. Fuimos, fuisteis, fueron. There are no accents on any of these forms. Dar is an AR verb, however it takes on ER and IR preterite endings, and there are also no accents on this verb in the preterite tense. So if you look at the conjugation below, di, diste, dio, dimos, distes, dieron, again it's an AR verb that has ER and IR preterite endings without any accents. It's important to note the verb ver is an ER verb and has ER and IR preterite verb endings. However, it does not carry any accents in the preterite tense. So take a look at the conjugation below, ver, to see. Notice it does not have any accents, whereas normally there would be an accent on the yo form and the el, ea, usted form. But there aren't in the conjugation of ver in the preterite. Now the last group of irregulars in the preterite tense that we're going to talk about, I like to call super irregulars because they are very, very irregular. I divide them into 3 groups, the J group, the U group, and the I group, because the conjugations have a J added to the conjugation, a U added to the conjugation, and an I added to the conjugation. Please note all the verbs that belong to each group. Here are the irregular endings for these groups of verbs. Notice the J group has no accents on it with a mixture of endings. And the U group and I group also have a mixture of endings, no accents. The one thing that you have to note is that the third person plural of the J group is different than the third person plural of the U and I group. Now we're going to go over the conjugations of the verbs that are found in this group. Caber is a part of the U group, and please note the irregular stem coup. Saber in the U group, soup is the irregular stem. Estar, estuve. Tener, tuve. Andar, anduve. Poner, pus. Poder, pud. Now we're moving on to the I group. Venir, the irregular stem is vin. There's an I in there. Querer, quis. Hacer, is. And please notice in hacer, the third person singular, the C changes to a Z to maintain pronunciation. Moving on to the J stems, verbs that end in UCIR all are considered J stems. So an example is conducir, conduch, deser, dich, trajer, trach. That concludes our slideshow. If you need to re-watch this presentation to copy down notes better, please feel free to do so. Thank you for watching, and good luck with your use of the preterite tense.